Hello, I'm Dr. Harriet Fraad.
And I'm Professor Juliana Forlano here with our podcast, Capitalism Hits Home.
This is a show about the intersection of capitalism, race, class, gender, and all the other intersecting and mutually developing parts of our lives. And I am broadcasting from my chaotic, just moved in room, which you may notice.
From wherever we come from, we are aiming to educate, activate, and alleviate some of the burdens we all experience living in a capitalist USA.
We hope that this program serves you well. And of course, we want to hear from you whether it does or doesn't, especially whether it does. But at any rate, it's brought to you by Democracy at Work.
Well, Harriet, we've been on a small hiatus of a couple of weeks, and I'm so glad that we're back. You were moving. There was a couple of other moving parts issues. And in the meantime, YouTube has actually closed its studios in New York City. So all of this, production that is happening is now in people's homes, in separate studios. So I'm glad that we could still create this podcast, even though YouTube has closed all of its studios from New York to LA to everywhere in between.
Yeah, I think they probably realized they could save more money by closing them. But whatever it is, here we are and glad to be here.
Something exciting happened this week. Last week, actually. And we are here to talk to you about it. So President Joe Biden, his American Jobs Plan is being debated now in the Congress. And one of the things that he did, which is just so exciting, is that he is looking to put $400 billion toward expanding quality home and community care. This is an enormous thing. So there's $2 trillion in the whole American Jobs Plan. There's going to be, the plan was supposed to be for infrastructure. $621 billion for roads, bridges, and public transit, ports, waterways, airports. These are the kinds of things you think of historically when you're talking about infrastructure. And I made a comment on a different show that it's not all man jobs because a lot of women work in construction these days, but there is a certain dog whistling of construction. So blue collar man jobs, is what the right wing uses infrastructure jobs to talk about. But Biden is doing something so amazing. $400 billion he has committed, if it passes, to fund the care infrastructure for a just and humane society. This, Asian Poo, I don't know if you know who she is. She's the co-founder and the executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is a group who's been fighting for years to convince policymakers all over the place to improve the circumstances of people who work as caregivers for the elderly, mostly women, by the way, people with disabilities, and all of the caregivers in our lives, and that those care structures have to be seen as critical infrastructure. And she's calling this plan historic and transformative, which is, we have talked, Harriet, about the care economy in the past. The fact is, Biden is going to make it, if I'm getting this correct, he's going to make it so that people don't necessarily have to worry about whether they will be cared for in their old age. He will be making care jobs respectable and sought after and well compensated, something that they are not at this moment in time. And I think he's going to bring down the anxiety level of every person in America who's worried about winding up living in their elder years underneath a bridge, next to the river. Harriet, can you talk about this historic seed of a care movement for which you've been working tirelessly your whole career?
Well, it's an enormously important thing. It began with a declaration in 1919. It's been around for a long time. And in 1973, the UN had a resolution, and 173 nations accepted this pay equity resolution. They didn't really have pay equity, but they accepted a resolution for gender equality in pay. The United States was one of the 14 holdouts that didn't sign it and never has. This is a long development. It's a long development that comes from the idea that just as the racist idea that Black and brown people are destined to serve white people as inferiors, that women are destined to serve men, to take care of their homes, their bodies, their children, their sexual needs, their relatives. This is gender baggage from which women have suffered and from which women of color particularly suffer as they have been relegated to domestic labor. There was a push to change labor's position, but in order to get the southern states support for it, it excluded domestic workers who were mainly Black and agricultural workers who were mainly Black and are now mainly Black and Hispanic. And so that's been a huge deficit. Jacinda Ardern is from the Socialist Labor Party. She was committed not only to equality in terms of income, but in terms of gender and race. And just as most of domestic workers and farm workers in the United States are people of color, that's true in New Zealand, where they're mainly people from the Pacific Islands or the Maoris, who were the indigenous population who was discriminated against as Native Americans are discriminated against. So she decided, look, pay equity is something they long established in New Zealand, which means equal pay for equal work. So a man and woman doing exactly the same job should be paid the same. That's one thing. Worker and work value equity is the equity of the value of different kinds of work. And so what she did was she measured the skills. She had a big project, the skills that go into things that are primarily female, like daycare work, like social work, like nursing, like nurses' aid work, and like domestic caregiving work for the elderly, which are usually minimum wage jobs. 55% of people getting minimum wages are women. And so they're women's jobs. Mm-hmm. Also, in this pandemic, women have lost in the United States 12.1 million jobs because they've had to drop out and take care of their children because the schools are closed. We don't have a system of quality public daycare the way other countries do. And we are an outlier. We don't have parental leaves. We don't have maternity and paternity leaves. We don't have guaranteed vacations, unlike the other developed nations of the world. And so caregiving has devolved primarily on women.
We also don't really live in community anymore.
No, and also the older people who used to take care of your kids are all working, if they can get a job, and are not living nearby and not able to come over and take care of your children. And so women have been alone with their children. And if they have to work on jobs that are called essential but are not paid as if they're essential, then the children are just left alone or with siblings who can't do their schoolwork. So this is a national tragedy in the United States. And so Biden has actually looked to the example, although he doesn't cite it, the example of the socialist labor prime minister who is a feminist in New Zealand to look for actually the equity of value of women's work. What are the skills involved in taking care of children? Because without his work, daycare workers are paid less than parking attendants. And this is a tragedy. And so they'll
pay more to watch their So they'll pay
Well,
someone more to watch your car than they will for them to watch your child.
exactly. And so he has realized this is a tragedy here, as women have lost 12.1 million jobs, and women are overwhelmingly poor. And 1 in 4 American children now goes hungry because their mothers are too poor to feed them properly. And because they can't get the school lunch, which was their only, and school snack, which were the only meals that they could count on in their lives. So we're in a national tragedy here. And Biden has followed, to some extent, Jacinda Ardern's excellent example and the example of New Zealanders who all accept that pay value equity is important, that no one can, in good conscience, reject it. They don't have the kind of right wing we do. But in any case, yeah, what?
Harriet, I have a summary of the infrastructure plan. Well, just the part that we're talking about. There's all kinds of things in there, like environment, et cetera. And we are not taking a side or, espousing party politics here, but this is what is in the current White House's summary of this plan. Even before COVID-19, our country was in the midst of a caregiving crisis, as you, Harriet, just discussed. In addition to caring for children, families feel the financial burden of caring for aging relatives and family members with disabilities. And there is a financial strain for people with disabilities living independently to ensure they're getting care in their homes. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of people who need better care are unable to access it, even though they are qualifying under Medicaid. Caregivers, who are disproportionately women of color, have been underpaid and undervalued for far too long. Wages for essential home care workers are approximately as $12 an hour, putting them among the lowest paid workers in the country. 1 in 6 workers in this sector live in poverty. And basically what's going to happen if this plan can make its way somehow through the gauntlet of right-wing and fascist propaganda that's already coming out against it. They can always pay for another war machine, but paying for someone to care for children or the elderly, that seems like they have a hard time with that. Anyway, what it will do is it expand access to long-term care services under Medicaid. Anyone who's ever tried to get long-term care services under Medicaid, or God forbid, at home care for someone who doesn't need to necessarily be in a place, but they need help, or the kind of care that's not necessarily the changing of a feeding tube, for example, but it's, I need help with a shower. I need help with cleaning my place so it doesn't fall into a disrepair. This would actually help with that, which is shocking. And it also puts into place an infrastructure to create good middle-class jobs with a free and fair choice to join a union for those workers, those home healthcare workers. It's called the HCBS expansion under Medicaid. It will support well-paying caregiving jobs with benefits, on the table, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's very important because what it does is it looks at the value of the work. And if we talk about infrastructure, the things that hold us up are not necessarily at the bank. It's not bankers' transactions. It's the food that we get. It's the food that's grown and picked and stored. It's the food that's presented to us by the essential workers in the grocery store. And I'm mentioning a whole raft of badly paid people. It's physical care when we are infirm or when we're too young to care for ourselves. And it's psychological care to hold us together, which we don't have much of either. So it's social work and psychology. And one of the things that's so important about this infrastructure is it includes the emotional labor, the infrastructure that allows people to be comforted. For example, the pay in New Zealand, where they've done the advanced work on this, for people who work at old age homes is the same as the pay for prison guards, because they don't have safety the way prison guards do, but sometimes the patients can get violent 1 minute and be emotionally broken down and needed to be held together the next minute. And it's physically taxing because you have to lift people. And they found a wage structure that's parallel to what prison guards get. But prison guards are overwhelmingly male, even in women's prisons. And nursing home attendants and domestic helpers are primarily women and have gotten less than half of the wages that men have gotten. So this is enormously important.
I
It
wonder if
changes
people will
the
even.
value of women's labor, of women's traditional labor, of women's position in the world. It's really important. Sorry.
It no,
Yeah.
don't be sorry at all. It's wonderful. I'm just kind of stricken by the fact that not only will this be great for people who need care, as you said, but that change in values, um, and especially coming off a basically a fascist dictator president in the United States who, you know, was grabbing women, bragging about grabbing women by the vagina, and probably a child rapist. Am I right in being able to say that, or am I going to get in trouble? I'm not sure.
Well, he
Um,
frequently flew on the Lolita Express run by Jeffrey Epstein that landed in Slave Island where you got to rape youngsters.
right. So if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably
Yeah,
a rapist president.
yeah, that's the
Just
truth.
just to change the value system in America so that care it is women, but also I think we've talked about this before on the show that even men have been taught not to care because it's not
Yeah,
lucrative and you can't support a
exactly.
family on caring. And the psychology of having to go to work and fight and in a capitalist system and then come home and switch your entire persona so that you can be loving and caring and do the things that work to be part of a family. That that I just feel like this can have some very long extending positive implications for our society.
It surely can, because in our society, the only cultural place that seems to value what was the traditional labor of women, which is taking care of the household, providing cleanliness, providing emotional care, providing physical care, cooking, cleaning, shopping, taking care of children, are eulogized in country and Western music, which is kind of right wing propaganda put to music, which is, how wonderful mama is. She did all these things, no charge, but she's a devalued citizen. And if her husband
But
says,
my
fine,
wife, I'll just totally devalue and go on. My
exactly.
mom's good, but not my wife.
And also, the wife better serve me when I get home, which is why the divorce rate is a majority divorce rate, because men were trained, often in their families of origin, that the women will clean up and cook and take care of you if you're upset and take care of your children. And they are going out and bringing home a salary that until the 70s could support that arrangement, a dependent wife and children. But since the late 70s has been inadequate, both people are expected to work. Women are really not signing up for the second shift of working for men while men expect to be served. And the divorce rate is wild, and 73% of divorces are initiated by women. So the whole gender framework is up in the air now as the economy has changed and men's well paid jobs were outsourced by the capitalists. And so
It's
here
very
we are.
interesting because now we're going to have women's well-paid jobs.
Yeah,
And in a way that women don't have to sort of, um, I don't know what you want to call it, set aside the goddess or, push down the femininity to compete in the marketplace. There's just something about the rise of valuing care. I'm flabbergasted and thrilled because we've talked about it, we read about it, we fight for it, we march for it, and now someone has added it to a bill. It may or may
yes,
not pass, but this is
it's
huge.
huge. It is huge. And in America, the demand is you put your money where your mouth is. So if you believe women are equal citizens, you better put your money on it. and they haven't put their money on it. Even where they've mouthed equality, there's no money on it. This is putting your money where your mouth is on women's equality, because those skills that were developed in taking care of men and children in the home have been employed in the workplace. One of the reasons that the majority of managers in the United States are now women is the skills that are needed for managers are skills of negotiation, skills of understanding, rather than skills of coercion and manhandling, with the emphasis on manhandling. The idea
I
is
was
to
hoping you were
create
going to say that.
cooperation. And these have been devalued at the same time as they are the infrastructure from which we all live. You know, there's something called failure to thrive as a psychological diagnosis. If kids aren't emotionally cared for, babies aren't picked up and held and talked to, they die and they stop developing. They can't turn over, lift up their heads, learn to walk, because emotional care is the infrastructure that allows us all to grow. And yet, because it was associated with women, it was taken for granted. And this changes that taking for granted and puts women's labor, women's traditional labor, on a map of value, which is
Harriet,
revolutionary.
Harriet, at the top of the show, I mentioned how I thought it was so interesting, like what might happen to the actual psychology of Americans to know that you will have in-home health assistance. You will have not just health assistance, but assistance for, say, taking a shower. Again, that's not, you know, it's easier to get Medicaid to cover if you need, you know, some sort of, you know, testing or needles or whatever it is that you need that's specifically medical care. But people need help in other ways, and that would be covered under this. And just the psychology, like when you step into Canada, it's almost like you cross the border and the anxiety drops. First of all, there's very little guns. And second of all, they have a social safety net where they know that they're going to be cared for. They also have a marketplace where they can compete, etc. But just the level of anxiety that can be lowered just knowing that your mom is going to be okay and you don't have to drop out of college because she gets cancer or something like that.
And also that you can have a child and not be immiserated because it costs more than a community college to have it each semester to have childcare that's quality care. And it means you don't have to worry that your kid is in a wet diaper watching television in some cheap daycare. You can rest assured that your child is safe. That's another thing. It's one of the reasons that the United States is not top of the World Happiness Index. There's a World Happiness Index that came out in 2021 in January this year for the top countries, and America is not at the top. In fact, we've gone down from 13th to 16th, or no, it's 13th, I think, to 19th recently.
Actually, that makes me feel better. If you were like, we're at the top, I'd be like, what's wrong with me? But, you know.
Well, Americans have, I'm sure it's even worse because Americans are supposed to be chipper. So if somebody asks, are you happy? You're supposed to say yes. Like, do you believe in God? Yes, whether you do or not. Or do you love your mom? Yes, even if you hate her. There are things
Yeah.
Americans say yes to. And one of
There's
them is
also
they're
like
happy.
a certain shame factor to be like, I'm very, very highly unhappy, even though I have running water and vaccination, you know, whereas there are countries who
Don't.
don't.
Yeah, who don't and who might be
There's a
happier.
shame.
In
They
any
might be
case,
happier. Yeah.
even if you go to a place like France, where elderly people are taken care of and where they have a superb daycare system, which starts at about, well, it starts with prenatal care. And then when your baby is born, you can take your baby to a drop in childcare center for $1 an hour. It's really quite remarkable. but you don't have the burden of worrying about everyone else and your own care in aging, and whether the fund you've paid into will then have disappeared or they will have cheated you and you'll be out on the street. It's a huge boon. But even more than that, it recognizes the markers of work of half the population. Half the population, actually a little more than half the population, it's female. And we've been devalued because our traditional labor has been considered an outgrowth of some genetic manifestation rather than hard labor to which we have been chained by gender. And that's a very important thing. It's also important for race because since those jobs were devalued and lower paid, they were allocated to brown and black women. And so that it's a big race change. I should say that Biden has been very progressive on race and gender. Class is another thing. Class is much more a factor in, let's say, socialist New Zealand. I keep citing my wonderful heroine who is Jacinda Ardern, but she just raised the minimum wage to $20 an hour and is paying for that and the care giving that she is paying well through much higher taxes on the wealthy. Great idea, which New York is just starting to entertain, just starting. But that, of course, this is the backbone of our existence. Care. Without food, without prepared food, without order, which I really appreciate in the disorder of my recent move, we don't function well. And
Harriet, we have come to the end of our, I can't believe it. I didn't even get a chance to say something that was so important on my mind, which is the idea of this. If this care economy passes, if this American Jobs Program passes, and the care economy becomes part of our, part of what we as Americans consider infrastructure, it is going to be huge. And as someone who believes in healthcare for all, this isn't healthcare for all, but it comes close to healthcare for all. And in 2 or 3 or 5 years, we're going to be discussing our social safety net will be Social Security, if we still have it, hopefully, Medicaid and Medicare, and care. And that is unbelievable that we are having, the possibility of having a whole nother wing of our social safety net just be put in through the infrastructure bill and not have a big fight over Medicaid for all. It was very sneaky and very wonderful. And most people don't realize that this is happening. The right wing is all over the news talking about how are we going to pay for it? Oh, this thing is too expensive. I don't care how we pay for it. We need to pay for it because it is just that important to have care be part of the infrastructure of the considered part of the infrastructure of the United States. We have about 1 second left, so I'm sorry to have to cut it off at that.
We'll continue next time.
That's right. We're going to continue our conversation in the next episode. Thanks for watching.
And thank you so much for watching, for writing to us, for engaging with us, because the whole point is to reach you. Goodbye for now.